Welcome to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. Coming up on today's show, the military has been given the task of protecting big oil's interests. And we'll talk with Ring of Fire co-host Bobby Kennedy about why American taxpayers are having to pay to protect the oil industry products. And news stories are emerging about the criminal conduct of Bank of America, and investigative journalist David Dayen will be here to tell us about the latest revelations about that company. The Supreme Court issued some disastrous rulings for consumers this week, and will tell you why your rights and your health are now in severe jeopardy. We'll have this story for you later on, but right now, just remember, you've entered the Ring of Fire.
You can't change Washington from the inside. You can only change it from the outside.
Grand jury secrecy rules.
For political gain.
The press can find out.
That has nothing to do with politics, but go ahead.
It wouldn't bother me.
Oops.
In South America, oil companies have enlisted armies to help protect their interest, and until recently that practice was limited to third world countries. But today that practice has come to North America, and I have author and Ring of Fire co-host Bobby Kennedy with me now to talk about it. Bobby, the militarization of the pipeline, no surprise to you. You've been following this story since day one. But I think the American public doesn't understand exactly what's happening, and that is that they have focused this issue, the corporate America, and they have figured out that if they can vilify activists and make activists look like terrorists and criminals, they win. Lay the story out for us, if you would.
Well, the twist on this story, Mike, is that in this case, and we've seen this happening for 2 decades, but in this case, a local group called Bold, Nebraska, which is made up of Nebraska ranchers and farmers and activists, sent a Freedom of Information request to the federal government and the state police agencies, and they were able to find documentation that TransCanada, which is the Canadian company that is building the XL Keystone Pipeline, is actually training federal law enforcement officials and federal law and state of Nebraska state troopers to fight and battle and investigate and criminalize and marginalize environmental activists who might want to express their opinion against the pipeline. As I've said to you, this has happened. This is part of a long trend to criminalize and to marginalize environmental activists. We've seen this happen again and again. In 2006, we saw the federal government during the Bush administration pass the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, which is an act that makes it a federal crime to interfere with the operations of a factory farm. We've seen this again and again. You know, Pap, you would probably not even believe this if you didn't know it, but as you know, in 17 states, we now have laws that are called food libel or veggie libel laws that make it illegal to criticize the operations of a factory farm, and in some cases to actually photograph a factory farm or a factory farm animal from a public road. You may say to yourself, and I think most Americans who hear this will say, that's nonsense. We have a First Amendment in this country. There's no state legislator, much less legislature, that's reckless or crazy enough to try to pass a law that impedes people's capacity to speak against a corporation, or to say that food is bad or may not be good for you, it may not be nutritious. But ask Oprah Winfrey, because she had a former factory farmer on her show who criticized factory farming and factory farming meat, and she was prosecuted in the state of Texas. And she had to go to a jury trial, which meant that her entire show and her network had to move their operations to the state of Texas during the pendency of that jury trial. So we're seeing this all over the country. You know, Rich Perlstein has a terrific article in this week's Rolling Stone magazine where he talks about this bifurcation of enforcement. During the Bush administration, the FBI put environmental terrorism as one of their top 3 threats, internal threats to this country. Environmental terrorists like Earth First have never killed anybody. But there's a lot of other domestic terrorist threats that have, for example, the Oklahoma City bombing and the kind of right-wing racist paramilitary threats that you see in Idaho and Ohio and Michigan and Florida and many other states, anti-abortion activists who've killed many people and set off many bombs. You don't see that in the environmental community.
Bobby, it appears to me that what has happened is that the activist movement has simply been outmaneuvered by Madison Avenue. Madison Avenue has been able to frame the idea that the people who used to be the only people in the way of tearing down our forest, polluting our water, polluting our air, the only people in the way of that were people who were willing to leave their jobs, willing to leave their family, willing to put themselves at great risk to stop all of that. Now, what has happened is Madison Avenue has taken this, they've focused it, they even have the police, they even have the military convinced that people who want to stop something like the XL pipeline are criminals. You actually have been, you've been involved in that directly, haven't you? You've been arrested trying to stop this.
Yeah, but I was arrested for doing something that was clearly illegal, and I intended to be arrested, and there's a difference between that. And you know, it's important for Americans and American law enforcement and politicians to understand the difference between deliberate civil disobedience, which I did, which is not terrorism. A terrorist bombs something or destroys property and then sneaks away. Somebody who commits civil disobedience, the rules are well established, you get yourself arrested, you do it peacefully, and you take responsibility for whatever crime that you commit. You try not to damage property or human beings. And that's what we did. But you're right, there's a conflation that Madison Avenue has engineered on behalf of the polluters, the big PR companies that represent the polluters classically, Burstyn, Marcella, and Hill and Knowlton, have very cleverly over the past 2 decades conflated environmental special interests with public interests. In other words, what they say is, why should we pay attention to the environmentalists? They're just another special interest. They're no different morally or in other respect, patriotically or altruistically or philanthropically than an oil company. But that ignores the distinction between people who are acting for special interests, in other words, to line their own pocketbooks, and people who are acting for the public interest, to make America live up to her ideals and to fight for the cause of justice for the entire community. And that's, you know, that is the difference that has been ignored and glossed over and conflated here. And then now they've gone even further and said that environmental activists are actually terrorists. People who interfere with corporate profit taking ought to be arrested.
Bobby,
and that is fascism.
Bobby, isn't the very fact that we're having this conversation, how odd it is that we're having a conversation that a person that wants to save our drinking aquifer from the XL pipeline, that we're having to say, well, you know, they're really not terrorists. The success of it is, the Madison Avenue success is, they've done a good job. Now, let me move to something. There was a slideshow that kind of became part of the public domain through Alternet. It was called the Protester Motivations. And the Protester Motivations was a slideshow that was used by the folks trying to push this pipeline through the middle of America. And the slideshow is to say, how do we get police officers angry at activists? How do we get the military involved with stopping activists? How do we do all those things? That slideshow is revealing, isn't it, Bobby?
Well, yeah, it is, because it essentially demonstrates, it shows how the military it encourages the military, it encourages police and enforcement, the militarized arm of the state, to essentially entrap environmentalists and to view them as the enemy, as the criminal, and the pipeline as the society that they're supposed to protect. It's interesting, in Rich Perlstein's article, he talks about a group in Ohio, an environmental group in Ohio that was a peaceful group, and they were infiltrated by the FBI. The FBI introduced them, the FBI informer actually persuaded them to engage in an act of violence. And he was the leader. They objected, but he browbeat them into doing it. Then he introduced them to a bomb maker. He obtained the bomb for them, and they ended up trying to bomb a small bridge. Meanwhile, at the exact same time, in the state of Florida, a white power group that wants to kill black people and kill politicians who fight for civil rights laws was actually planning a major terrorist attack on our country, and the FBI refused to arrest anybody that had anything to do with it. So you have this bifurcation of enforcement priorities that is really distorted, and it's stilted towards going after people who interfere with corporate profit taking. And a minute ago, I used the word fascism, and I don't use that word lightly. I use it according to the dictionary definition of it, which says that it is the merger of state and corporate power. We have to understand, Pap, that that the domination of government, of business by government, is called communism. The domination of government by business is called fascism. And what we need to do is walk a narrow trail in between, which is free market capitalism and democracy, and keep big government at bay with our right hand, big business at bay with our left. And what we're seeing now is this extraordinary merger that we have not seen before in American history, except perhaps for a brief time during the 1880s and 1890s, when you did see government military deployed on behalf of big businesses in the Pinkerton strike to machine gun the union organizers in the Blair Mountain strike in 1920.
Bobby,
and we really almost lost democracy at that time. Now you're seeing the same group deployed against environmentalism. And I remember something that Pat Robertson wrote that was picked up by all of the right wing in this country, which is green is the new pink. In other words, the environmental movement is the new enemy that's going to replace communism after 1988, after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And that's what they're trying to do, marginalize environmentalists so that to make us less effective at trying to put the reins in the mouth of these corporations that are running roughshod.
I guess if you the take away from this, I guess on a positive aspect, is that obviously they are concerned about environmental activism. They're concerned to the point to where they came out with this elaborate slideshow about how to deal with activists. The activist that's out there, the activist that's standing in front of the pipeline, the activist that's out there talking about global climate change, clean water, clean air, they actually are having a positive effect. That is very clear when you see what's happening out of Madison Avenue to try to answer all this. Bobby Kennedy, thanks for joining me.
That's the good news, Pap. Thanks a lot for having me.
When we come back, we'll tell you about the Supreme Court's giveaway to the big drug industry. I'm Mike Papantonio. You're watching Ring of Fire.
You're watching Free Speech TV, a network powered by the people.
Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. Last week, the U.S. Supreme Court handed the drug industry a free pass to kill, pass to cripple American consumers without any fear of being held accountable. Mainstream media barely even reported on it. Joining me now to talk about our corporate court's decision that puts all Americans at risk is Tim O'Brien. Tim, the Bartlett decision is one of those decisions that American consumers won't really understand how hard they were hit by this corporatist Supreme Court until it's them and it's their loved one or it's their family member that is in trouble. Lay out the Bartlett case. Tell us how egregious this decision is by the Supreme Court. It's an awful decision.
It is an incredibly awful decision. A woman in the case below took a drug that was branded as Clinipril, and the drug was actually generic. It was called a Sulindac. And she took it and contracted a horrible, horrible skin disease where essentially her skin turned to bone, left her unable to move, essentially fossilized this woman. The issue in the case is simply this: can generic drug companies be liable for a drug that does more harm than good? That's the simple question.
Tim, the problem here is this is a case where the jury came back and actually awarded this woman somewhere in the neighborhood of $20 million plus, and then the generic pharmaceutical company then takes it up to the Supreme Court and says, gee, yes, we did some awful things, our conduct was bad. I mean, really, if you take a look at it, but you can't hold us responsible because we didn't come up with the original design. Take it from there.
Right, and the issue before the Supreme Court was simply this. Well, you have a drug that's out there on the market doing these things to people. You don't have to sell it. No one is sticking a gun to your head making you sell it. And it comes down really, Pap, to the issue of what we call core conservative values, which is what? Choice and consequence. You have a choice, drug company, to sell this product. Now you got to live with the consequences of that choice. Well, this Supreme Court said, you know what? Generic manufacturers get a get out of jail free card. They can make the choice, but they don't have to live with the consequences, and that's what resulted in this case.
Well, and the irony here, Tim, is that here you have everybody looking, you have all the American media looking at the big cases, you know, the gender right cases, the same-sex marriage case, the voting rights case, which is very important, don't get me wrong. But here you have a case that now says that your family, your children, you could take a generic drug where the manufacturer clearly knew that there was a huge risk of you becoming blind from the drug, of your liver closing down because of your renal system closing down, of it killing you. The drug company, the generic company knows that. Nevertheless, they sell the drug and they have the protection of absolute immunity if you really take this from beginning to end. Did I get that right, or is it overstatement?
Well, no, it's actually an understatement, Pat, because think about it. What is the generic drug company doing? It is legally stealing from a branded drug company its formula. Did no research on it, did not patent it, just sat back and waited for the time to pass where the drug company now has nothing to do but steal someone else's product and sell it for profit. And that goes back to our core message in liability law, which is, hey, look, if you were going to create risks that did not otherwise exist, you have a responsibility here. And that concept, which goes back 100 years, no longer applies to generic drug companies.
And in this case, Tim, my memory is that the generic company had already been put on notice of the potential problem. The generic company took the product, did no independent clinical data testing, did no second run through the FDA to say, now, are you sure this is right? They simply took all of the bad parts of that drug, combined it with their desire to make a huge profit, and then they put the entire American public at risk with that drug. And let me point out, it's not just one drug now. Now this is all generic drugs are affected by this. What is your take on it?
That's absolutely correct, because the consumer has absolutely zero role in whether she takes a branded drug or a generic drug. And so this company that's sitting back there, this company which the Supreme Court has essentially regarded as a mope, a moron, totally incapable of making choices on its own and living with the consequences of those choices, all that company has to do now is something that very few other companies in the world can do, which is sit back and make money and not have to deal with the consequences of the risk that is being brought to the American public.
Tim, do you realize mainstream media has all but ignored this decision? I don't know whether you've followed that. Mainstream media, you won't see the decision on being really intelligently discussed on ABC, CBS, or any of the major networks. And part of the problem is because they get so damn much money from the pharmaceutical industry. The second part of the problem is its misdirection. We've seen it time and time again with the U.S. Supreme Court takes a decision that everybody's looking at. The decision might be voting rights. The decision might be same-sex marriage. And they pass through that decision, and they have you ignoring the decisions that really have such a huge impact on our lives. Didn't you see that unfolding, and couldn't you have called this? If I were to ask Tim O'Brien a month ago, what is the Supreme Court going to do? Haven't you seen them do the same type of thing in the past?
Yes, and Pap, I don't know if you read the Onion, but I would tell everyone to get out there and read it. Today's Onion, the parody newspaper, has a headline where it says, U.S. public says enough with these other cases already, Supreme Court, let's get to the gay stuff. And it actually talks about the Bartlett decision in there, kind of parenthetically or to the aside, saying the public doesn't care because they want to hear the interesting, sexy issues about gay marriage. But you're absolutely correct. They don't understand. The media does not understand how this impacts. What a huge percentage of drugs that are out there are generic drugs. And Pat, did you know that there are actually 450 drugs that are generic on the market for which the branded manufacturer has said, these drugs are too dangerous for us to sell. And the generic drug companies are still selling them because, of course, the FDA is not doing anything to make them take it off the market.
Yeah, they're called death drug throwaways, and there's this whole bunch of those drugs now that we're going to see the generics embrace and sell like snake oil because they understand if they kill the user, if they blind them, if they paralyze them, this Supreme Court says, well, you know, sorry. You know, there's no way that you're going to be able to recover. Now, isn't part of the problem here that we're so willing to try new drugs? We watch television. The television tells us, you know, are you sad? Are you glad? Did you have a bad day? Take this drug. It's the selling, direct-to-consumer type of selling that has these people that are going to be most affected by this going in and asking for these drugs to their doctors. In the problem, Tim, as I look at it, is they do that even when the product has not been on the market for more than a year or 2 years without waiting to see what is the casualty aspect of the drug.
Correct, and that initial marketing campaign, it never ever goes away because it impacts consumers' thought patterns, and even more importantly, it impacts and pervades how physicians think about it. So the physicians are conditioned or primed to wait for that patient to ask for it, and the mindset goes on for decades, even after the branded drug company has quit advertising. It changes the way that consumers think. Because we watch so much TV, it becomes part of the answer. Here's a problem, give me the script for the problem. And now, Pap, the generic drug companies, they represent in terms of pills moved. More than half the drugs that are taken in this country are generic pills. And these people have no recourse now.
In other words, 50% of the drugs being sold are generics. If the generic in that 50% kills you, blinds you, cripples you, you have no avenue. Was there any surprise to you that this was written, that this opinion was drafted by Alito, who obviously has such ties to the industry? Aren't you able, as an attorney most of the time, to figure out, is corporate America going to benefit from this? And if they're going to benefit, you know what Alito is going to do, you know what Thomas is going to do, you know what Scalia is going to do, Kennedy, unfortunately. I mean, you can call it right off the bat, can't you?
Yes, and absolutely. And here's what's interesting about Justice Alito. He actually recuses himself from pharmaceutical cases because of his extensive holdings in pharmaceutical stocks. But he does not recuse himself where there's a one-vote difference, such as in this opinion, a 5-4 decision. A 4-4 decision would have let stand the decision of the First Circuit, which held that, yes, the generic drug company can be held liable. Alito, even though he's recusing himself from all these other pharmaceutical cases, steps in, notwithstanding his conflict, and not only does he step in, he writes the opinion.
Tim, we've gotten away from the idea of stare decisis, or we've gotten away from the idea of precedent with the court. We used to say the Supreme Court is going to rule according to how they've looked at this issue in the past. They're going to have some precedent. They're going to have some ideas in place that we're simply not going to change all that easily. This court has turned that on its head as an activist court that I don't think is second to any that I've ever seen in my lifetime.
Yeah, absolutely. When you actually read the opinion, you see some blatant false statements. For instance, in one part of the opinion, the Justice Alito writes, well, the federal regulations permit the Sulindac label, which New Hampshire law forbids. Well, that's complete horse hockey. New Hampshire law doesn't attempt to forbid any drug label. It simply says, if you make the choice to sell this drug with this label, then under our system of laws, you have to be ready to handle the consequences. Now the consequences have been taken away. The choice is free to you to make, generic drug company. The profits are there for you to make, but the consequences are no longer yours to bear.
One thing I can't end this segment without mentioning is that the Obama administration actually argued on behalf of the drug companies, went to court in front of the Supreme Court on behalf of the drug companies to see that this passed on behalf of the drug companies. What's your take on that?
It floored me. It floored me. I don't know how any politician, be they dog catcher, mayor, president, governor, what have you, could with a straight face say that you are pro-consumer after having done what you did before the Supreme Court in this case.
And they didn't have to, they did it willingly. They appeared there and they argued on behalf of the drug industry to the detriment of consumers all over America. Tim O'Brien, thank you for joining me. This is a story that probably won't affect, nobody's going to pay attention to it until it affects them or their family. But thank you for joining me.
You're welcome, Pat.
When we come back, we'll be taking a look at the deceptive mortgage practices of Bank of America. Stay tuned. We're going to be right back with more Ring of Fire. You're witness to a political coup taking place right in front of your damn eyes. That caliber of evil needed to be held accountable in courtrooms. Billionaire mad money wasn't enough to buy democracy. Legislators don't have enough sense to think for themselves. They let Alec do it. Here at Ring of Fire, the truth is our only agenda, so we're able to bring you the stories that mainstream media just ignored or completely got wrong.
Tune into Free Speech TV for Democracy Now!, a national, independent, award-winning news program bringing you people and perspectives rarely seen on corporate media.
Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. It was recently revealed that Bank of America encouraged their employees to lie and cheat in order to sell mortgages to people who couldn't afford them. This deceit helped lead to the massive foreclosure crisis in America. I have investigative journalist David Dayen with me to tell us about what Bank of America is doing now in the world of banking crime. It's all new. David, Bank of America leading the scam criminality one more time. Another story emerging. It's just as ugly as the last one. Lay the story out for us. What's Bank of America up to?
Sure. Well, we've known for some time that homeowners are having a lot of trouble getting loan modifications from their bank, and in this case from Bank of America. What we didn't know and what's new is what's going on inside the bank. So there's a lawsuit in federal district court in Massachusetts, and as part of that lawsuit, it's a civil case, a class action case where homeowners who were denied modifications even though they were eligible are trying to get class action status. And part of that case, plaintiffs have submitted 6 sworn statements, affidavits from former Bank of America employees, and they describe just a sea of criminality inside this bank. Being purposefully denied loan modifications, being told to throw out documents, being told to lie to homeowners, being told to tell homeowners that their cases were under review when they weren't, have them continue to give in documents, hand in documents, and also they were given quotas for how many homeowners they could push into foreclosure, and even given staff bonuses for reaching those quotas.
David, let me ask you, first of all, this administration came out with something called HAMP. And HAMP was there to hopefully to save homeowners, to give homeowners another chance, so banks could recover from their stupidity the first round, which was just buying into CDOs and swaps and synthetics, the absolute criminal stupidity of that. And so the administration comes along and they say, we want to give you a chance to fight your way back, and that was with HAMP. Lay that story out for us and tell us how this Bank of America, along with other banks we're going to find, have violated this just at every turn.
Right. Well, the idea behind HAMP was that the government would give incentives, financial incentives, to banks to work out loan modifications with homeowners. The problem is the financial incentives weren't enough to offset all of the financial incentives that mortgage servicers have to actually foreclose on people over giving them a loan modification. And it ties into their compensation. The way that servicers are compensated, it makes more sense if they are able to extract foreclosure fees. When they push someone in foreclosure, they get paid off first before the investor does. So for a variety of reasons, the financial incentives are to delay, add on fees, and push people into foreclosure. And that's exactly what they did. And now we know from these insiders how they did it.
Well, now we're hearing the response from the banking industry that we all always hear, and golly gee, you got it wrong. There's inaccuracies in these affidavits. But you know what? That is such an absurd argument when you consider that these affidavits are coming from people who were at the top in supervision and who were the people doing the ordering around and actually saying, you must figure out how to put the homeowner in such a position to where A, they never get out of the foreclosure, B, the bank makes more money in the foreclosure, C, we look like we're complying with government regulations, but we're not under HAMP, and D, in the end, we keep this all a big secret. And now we find out the secret is not been kept, the story is out. This goes all the way to the top, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, these 6 loan level supervisors were from all over the country. So this isn't about one road call center or anything like that. And they also name names. They name specific executives who authorized and directed this conduct. And they also say that all this business was conducted by email. So there's physical evidence in this case as well. And so there's no reason that any of the attorneys general or the attorney general of the United States can't reopen an investigation. A lot of this conduct goes after any settlement was done. It postdates any covered conduct under the settlement. There's no reason why they can't go in, reopen new cases, subpoena the documents, get these sworn statements and more, because there was tons of turnover at these loan modification operations inside the servicers. And start prosecuting, because we have the names, we have the evidence, all we need is the will.
Okay, well now let's back up just a little bit. You talked about a settlement, and most people following this program probably know that Bank of America had to pay $25 billion for lying and cheating and stealing and committing criminal theft at just so many levels that we don't even have time to cover here. But rather than putting the people responsible in jail, the Justice Department gave Bank of America a get out of jail free card, pay $25 billion, don't ever do this again, and we're going to let the people who made all the decisions, the guys dressed up in 3-piece suits with Rolex watches, they're not going to have to go to jail because of this. So let's start from there, and then let's say, what did they do after they were given that free pass?
Right, and it wasn't even $25 billion, it was far less than that. I mean, the 5 banks who were in that big settlement paid $25 billion.
Right.
Theoretically, but what they really did was drop some air out of their books. I mean, they in hard dollars, it was really, between the 5 of them, only about $1.5 billion. So it was even more of a slap on the wrist than you're describing. And it's clear from these documents that all they did was pay off the fees that they had to pay off the penalties as the cost of doing business, and then went back to exactly the same conduct, at least as it relates to denying loan modifications to eligible borrowers.
We have a Justice Department that has propped up Wall Street at every turn. This president has been part of that. It's not, for us to ignore that is like ignoring a white elephant sitting in your damn living room. So we have a president who's participated in this. He's directed that this Justice Department not go after Wall Street. So the chances of anything being done on this is almost zero. What is, am I overstating that, or what is your take on it? You're very close to these stories. You follow them all the time. Have I stated that wrong?
No, you haven't. I completely agree with you. What I'm trying to get across is that this is completely possible. There are no hands that are tied at this point. And what we often hear is that, well, we put together a settlement and we're moving forward, but this is conduct that's beyond the settlement. And so I'm just trying to make the point that we certainly could see prosecutions if we had any kind of will or any kind of rule of law as it relates to Wall Street in this country. I completely agree with your assessment that we won't, but it's certainly within the realm of possibility. And anyone who's arguing that this couldn't happen and that the banks have already been sort of made immune to this is wrong.
Let's talk a little more about specifics about how ugly this story was. Now, by the way, this is a very well-written story. I know you have followed this regularly since the Wall Street burn down, even before. but the specifics in your story are startling to me. One thing that you talk about in your story is that you would have the Bank of America supervisors stringing the mortgage, the homeowners along, making them believe that if they start submitting to a new payment schedule, that they were going to be forgiven, they were going to be able to keep their home, there was going to be another way that they could get back into their home and not lose everything. That was all a lie, and supervisors told employees to perpetuate that lie. Isn't that, did I get that right?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the schemes they would do is they would ask for financial documents, because this was part of, getting a loan modification is looking at the financial documents and then working out an affordable payment for the homeowner. So they would ask for these documents, and then they would put them aside for 30 days. And then they would say once the 30 days were up that the documents were stale and they would have to be resubmitted. Meanwhile, all this time they were continuing to pursue the foreclosure process. And so it was really a win-win for them. They would delay a decision they would force people into a trial payment, delay the decision, at the end of it, reject someone for a permanent modification, and then immediately ask for the difference between the trial payment and their original payment, with the threat of foreclosure hanging over their heads. At that point, one of two things would happen. Either the borrower would go into foreclosure and lose their home, or they would accept a private modification, which was much more lucrative for the bank.
Okay, and from a standpoint of criminal prosecution, David, they were actually lying to the federal government about what they were doing. That is the nexus for this Justice Department, if we really had a Justice Department, being willing to go in and prosecute because they committed mail fraud. They committed fraud of so many ways, it's incalculable. So they commit this fraud. It's very clear that they're telling the employees to do this. They then are telling the government that they're not doing it, that they're complying with HAMP, H-A-M-P, which is a government program. And while that's happening, David, tell me about this notion of what they call the Blitz Day. What was the Blitz program that they would use to victimize these homeowners even worse? How did that work?
Yeah, the Blitz was described by a guy named William Wilson, who was a case management supervisor, and he described a process where every 2 weeks, all the case management supervisors were asked to throw out any documents in the system that were older than 60 days. And it didn't matter whether the people were eligible for loan modifications, if they were making all their trial payments, if they were 60 days old, they would throw them out. And this was, according to Bank of America, a way to reduce backlog in the system. But really, it's just a complete deceptive practice, because you're throwing people back to square one. They had submitted all their documents, they had made all their trial payments, they had complied with every requirement put on them by Bank of America, and just every 2 weeks through the Blitz, their documents would be thrown out, their cases would be closed, and they would be in this impossible situation.
Without the class action avenue that's open right now to homeowners, this case would go nowhere, and we have a Supreme Court that's trying to close down the class action process for consumers. Do you ever see this developing without class action, where we can hold the Bank of America accountable for their crimes?
No, you wouldn't, because all of this information came out in a lawsuit where the defendants or the plaintiffs are trying to get class action status. It should come out in the regular regulatory process or in the law enforcement process, because there is certainly this evidence that was available, and there were supposedly these investigations. But this only came out in a civil suit with class action status. And you're absolutely right. If class action status goes the same way that all of these other protections for consumers and for workers have gone in this Supreme Court session, then we'd be even in more trouble, and the courthouse door would even be that much more closed.
David Dayen, thank you. As usual, great material. Thank you for joining me, okay?
Thank you very much, Mike.
Coming up, we'll talk about Monsanto's plan to corporatize our food supply. We'll be right back. Stay with us right here on Ring of Fire. Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. The Monsanto Corporation has been working to create genetically modified foods for decades. Most of the times, consumers don't even know what they're eating. It is Monsanto's Frankenstein creation. I have attorney Howard Nations with me now to talk about what's happening to your food supply. Howard, party around Monsanto today and this entire year. What a gift they've been given. Can you imagine being the gift? No other industry I know that can't be sued for negligence. They can't be sued for causing harm to farmers. They can't be sued for causing harm to consumers. But this is a Congress that snuck in to the budget this relief bill for Monsanto. Tell us the GMO story in general.
The story of GMOs is that allegedly they're to increase the food supply for the hungry people of the world. The fact of the matter is that the real reason for the modification is that 75% of them are to increase crop tolerance of herbicides. 50% of them alone are to withstand Monsanto's Roundup herbicide. So that's what GMOs are all about.
Why is that? Why is that so important? In other words, they're making a crop, it's a Franken crop, it's a Frankenstein variation of corn and soybeans and rice, and it's this thing we haven't tested. We don't know whether it kills us in the long term or not. We know it kills rats because we tested that, right, but we don't know if it kills human beings. But what is the part of the Roundup story that people miss here?
Well, the problem with GMOs essentially is that these are not the standard hybrid that increases the number of plants you can produce. This is specifically to tolerate Roundup, the Monsanto product, and other herbicides. So we're producing a whole new group of modified foods that will tolerate Roundup. Now, the Roundup story is essentially they found that Roundup has been associated with miscarriage, birth defects, neurological development problems, DNA damage.
Okay, so we know this. Okay, so Congress knows this going into it. They know that this is purely a money issue. You see, now if a farmer has to almost use these products because Monsanto is able to say, listen, we're the only ones that make this product that can withstand a Roundup herbicide. We've made this for you. Now the farmer is out there realizing that once he plants that seed, it's over for his conventional or his or her conventional crop, right? Once it's in the ground, it's over for the future of that farm, isn't it?
That's true, because this is shocking, but 70% of the products in the United States contain ingredients of GMOs. And you would think that since there are obvious problems with it, there should be mandatory labeling. But when we try to get to mandatory labeling, which is supported by 90% of Americans and which 64 other countries require, there's been this great outcry from agribusiness. They spent $50 million, led by Monsanto, to defeat Proposition 37 in California that would simply warn Americans, consumers, about the fact that GMOs are in their products. Now, if there's nothing wrong with the food, if there's nothing wrong with the GMO, why are they so worried about us knowing about it? And then, of course, you come to what you opened with, which is the Monsanto Protection Act. This is one of the most outrageous things I've seen come out of an outrageous Congress. As we were approaching the fiscal cliff this year, remember back in March, a provision was anonymously placed into the legislation that said, amazingly, that if a judge has proven in his courtroom that GMOs are hazardous, risky to the health of consumers, that a court cannot stop the growth and sale of those products. Now that was placed in by Senator Roy. It was originally placed in anonymously. It was traced back to Senator Roy Blunt from Missouri, who incidentally has received $716,000 from agribusiness this year. Last month, the Democrats tried to take it out. In the current farm bill that's before the Senate right now, they include the provision to take the Monsanto Protection Act out. The amendment was killed by Senator Blunt.
Okay,
So,
let me just in this last 30 seconds, here's what's important. It's a product that hasn't been tested on humans. We don't know, no epidemiology to tell us what is up with this thing. The only tests that we have show that the product has the propensity to kill rats, cause cancer, cause tumors, cause neurological problems. We have an administration who knows all of that, but we also, by the way, Howard, also have an administration that's put one of the key advisors to this administration happens to have Monsanto contacts and roots that are a mile long. This is a story that really our children and grandchildren are going to be affected by. Howard, I appreciate you following this. This is the tip of the iceberg right here. And we're going to really hear the end of the story about 10 years from now when we start seeing what all of this yields. Thank you for joining me, Howard Nations.
thank you, Mike.
This past week, the U.S. Supreme Court released a flood of opinions that are horrendous for American citizens. Everything from voting rights to consumer safety have been taken away by our corporate court. And I have Farron Cousins from the Trial Lawyer magazine with me now to talk about that. Farron, assassination again of Martin Luther King and all the people who worked so desperately to try to move civil rights ahead in this country. An assassination took place by our right-wing majority on the U.S. Supreme Court. I don't see it any other way. They knew exactly what they were accomplishing. They've wanted to do this for a very long time. They've been waiting to do away with the Voting Rights Act, and they did that this week, didn't they?
They did. They're taking this country back to the early 1960s, late 1950s. And, you know, everybody was so concerned about Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act that we forgot to focus on the precursor, which was Section 4. And that's exactly what the U.S. Supreme Court has struck down. And that
explain that a little bit. Explain why Section 4, without Section 4, you have no voting rights protection that inures from the U.S. Justice Department, do you?
Right. Section 4 basically sets the criteria for what Section 5 is based on. See, Section 4 back in 1965 originally said you cannot enact any kind of test for voters, such as a literacy test, to see if they're competent enough to vote. And what this did back then, obviously, was disenfranchise millions of African Americans. So Section 4 says if you enact one of these tests, you are then subject to Section 5 review by the Department of Justice.
In other words, it was automatic. There wasn't any need to go and prove by statistics. There wasn't any need to spend millions of dollars trying to follow election after election, year after year, to show that there was some course of conduct that was taking place. It was automatic. If you do these things and you are in a suspect jurisdiction like Alabama or Mississippi or Florida or Texas, then we're going to know, you need to know that the Justice Department is going to be involved. They've taken that away, haven't they?
Right, and that's exactly what Section 4 did. Section 4 was the section of the Voting Rights Act that figured out who had to be approved by the Department of Justice. It did include states like Florida and Mississippi and Georgia and North Carolina and in some cases even Massachusetts. And that's why Section 4 itself had been reauthorized in the 70s. And in the 70s, they expanded it to include that you could not include any form of language test. Because back then they wanted it to be only English-speaking ballots, only English-speaking advertisements. And then in the 70s they said, no, that's again not fair. We have plenty of United States citizens, people who are here legally, people who have been here forever, that don't speak English. We cannot require people to speak English to vote. And that had been re-extended. And to be honest, it had been re-extended recently until the year 2031.
Well, that's what people don't understand. In other words, the Congress looked at all of it. They looked at everything the U.S. Supreme Court looked at. They looked at even more than the U.S. Supreme Court looked at. They concluded that racism and this effort to keep people away from the polls is still existing in these particular states and in all parts of the country for that matter. And therefore, we needed this protection. They had scientists, they had hours and days and weeks of hearings where they brought in experts from all over the country that showed them clearly that this problem still exists, and the projection was that it would still exist up until about 2031 because of the demographics change that were taking place. Now, Farron, let me ask you this. Is there any question, you've written article after article for the Trial Lawyer magazine about this, is there any question in your mind that this is a reaction of the U.S. Supreme Court majority conservatives, the elitos, the Alito, Thomas, Scalia, the Roberts, all the usual suspects, that it's a reaction by them because they understand that demographics are changing. They understand that they're corporate types that put them in the Supreme Court to begin with. The corporate types that followed their career, their entire career, and then had them appointed to the Supreme Court. The corporate America types are at risk because of the demographic shift, along with the Republican Party, obviously.
They are. I mean, the Republican Party right now was actually in danger of losing the South in the next couple election cycles. Study after study shows that African Americans are coming back to the South after leaving basically in the 70s and 80s, but now they're starting to come back. The Hispanic population in the South is booming, and that all means bad things for the Republican Party. So this U.S. Supreme Court does exactly what groups like the Heritage Foundation, the Federalist Society, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce wanted them to do. They've now thrown Section 4 out, basically created a clean slate, and now they're giving it to this Tea Party Congress saying, okay, guys, you come up with new criteria.
Isn't that the ugly part? They know this Congress will take no action. This is a Congress that took no action on the gun control, even though 75% of the American public wanted it. They've taken no action on immigration, and they're not going to take any action here. And when Roberts wrote that opinion in his conservative, right-wing, almost fascist mind, there's no other way to describe this majority right now. When he wrote that opinion, he understood there was no way that Congress would take action on that. In about 15 seconds, what do you think?
Oh, I completely agree. And if the Tea Party Congress chooses to leave this Section 4 blank, there is no enforcement of the Voting Rights Act. There's no avenue for the Justice Department to take to see who is discriminating against American voters.
Because there's no Section 5. Farron Cousins, thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
That's it for this week's Ring of Fire, but you can keep up with us throughout the week online at ringoffireradio.com or on Twitter at Ring of Fire Radio and on Facebook. I'm Mike Papantonio, and we'll see you next week right here on Ring of Fire.